Discrum is a game released in October of 2020, being published by Devolver Digital and developed by the creators of Minute, Heavy Bullets, High Hell, and Nuclear Throne. The game's description is this: Are you ready to get sliced in half? The year is 2089 and a giant disk has appeared in orbit of Jupiter. Step into the oversized spacesuit of a brave scientist and explore this sprawling intergalactic slaughterhouse. So, with no other information, I decided to check out this game and share my opinions on it, because why not? The game starts with a brief explanation of its story, set in 2091, which for some reason is different from the Steam description, and playing as a scientist with a yellow suit investigating a giant disk. There really isn't much to the rest of the story, just followed upon later by more short comic book segments, and it just seems to be a setting for the gameplay and less of an actual story. However, I'm glad there is a setting because it gives the gameplay a point, making it feel like there's a reason to everything that's happening. Right after the introduction, you get thrown into the first disc room, which is accurately titled Disc Room, though it isn't too accurate because I would call these saws and not discs, but I guess the game just wants to call them discs, so I'll let it happen. Now, this room is an excellent introduction to what the main gameplay is. Attempt to avoid discs, die, and repeat. After dying for the first time, new objectives pop up to unlock the surrounding rooms. This is basically the main gameplay. Avoid discs, die, repeat, unlock more rooms. The base gameplay is very simple, but it still makes for very frantic and quite intense gameplay, having to dodge so many discs as they just keep appearing on screen. There are a total of 64 disc types, all some variation of either bouncing around randomly or heading towards the player. Some are big, some are small, some are snakes, and some are mouths in the ground. This certainly keeps the gameplay from feeling stale, although many of the discs still have similar characteristics. As for what the player can do to dodge these discs, the main way of doing so is just by running away. There are only two possible ways to avoid these discs, which are, like I said, from running, or you could use one of 6 abilities that you get access to over the course of the game. All of these abilities did feel useful in some way, both to complete specific challenges and to dodge various discs. Still, even with all these additions, the gameplay just boils down to a simple idea. Attempt to survive as long as possible in a room where deadly discs fly around. For this reason, Disc Room is not a very long game. My playthrough of this game only ended up taking 2.5 hours, but How Long to Beat says 2 hours, so it's a short game. As for the style and graphics of the game, it does what it needs to. It's not an exceptional look, but it still looks quite clean. It has clear UI and distinct looking areas and enemies. It's pretty good. Now, as the game goes on, completing different challenges and unlocking new rooms, eventually you meet the gatekeeper of the Gray Zone. These gatekeepers are kind of like the bosses of this game, as they prevent you from accessing a new zone and shake up the gameplay a bit. I think that they're a great addition because of this change in the gameplay. Instead of the timer acting as a normal timer would, instead the timer is frozen and your goal is to change it by collecting these yellow orb things. This becomes an interesting challenge which changes gameplay from just surviving to surviving and collecting objects, making for quite an interesting boss fight. After defeating the first gatekeeper, a new zone is unlocked. Similar to the last one, but with one major change. Time only moves when standing in the circle in the middle of the room. Each of the 5 zones in the game have some unique feature to them, which introduces variety. However, many of these just seem to make the game more frustrating instead of adding anything. Instead of forcing decisions with quick reactions, these unique features end up making the gameplay feel the same each time, with luck being the main deciding factor between a successful run and yet another death. In the green zone, it forces you into a smaller area, making it so that you stay in there longer and have fewer options to work with. Playing it safe and moving out of there also doesn't work well, because even though you aren't progressing the timer, as time goes on, more discs still come after you, making it much harder to accomplish anything before you inevitably die. This is meant to be a game where you die frequently, but it should still be that you learn from each death. Instead, the random chance of discs coming in the small zone and forcing you out makes it feel like each death isn't up to the player at all. Some levels in this zone are still done quite well, but overall, I think the new gimmick of this zone makes it much less enjoyable. Now, the next zone is this red zone, which has the main feature of limiting visibility. While I really like the aesthetics of this zone, it looks quite great. limiting visibility does not make it better. Some levels are still done well, but many fewer than the last. I would say this is probably my least favorite zone in this game. Being unable to see which discs are coming after you makes this game much less dependent on strategy here and much more dependent on reaction time. I think the worst level in this zone, and in probably the entire game, is the level Perfect Dark. In this level, you can't see anything at all, and you have to hope that no discs come after you as you move around wildly attempting to survive for 10 seconds. Technically isn't that bad, because if you use your ability of slow motion you can see momentarily, although that ability runs out very quickly and it makes it still quite hard to predict which direction the discs are actually heading towards. And when I finally achieved the 10-second goal, despite having run out of visibility, I still managed to survive an extra 5 seconds just by running around in the dark cluelessly, which made for a quite unsatisfying completion. In addition, another level in this zone, Timeless, had a very unsatisfying completion, which was not due to game design, but it was due to, I think, was a bug. Because it was actually an interesting challenge. Only 2 discs were ever in the room at a time, and the goal was to die with 4 discs in the room, with the timer stuck at 0 seconds. However, at a point, the challenge was just randomly marked as completed without any explanation as to why for me. Now later I figured out what I was supposed to do, which was use the absorb ability to transfer a disc from room to room, but it just ended up not working out that way, which just made it very unsatisfying. Overall, I think the red zone just makes the game much more frustrating, which has just many unclear objectives and just focuses on reducing the information the player has, which makes the gameplay much simpler and less interesting. Now, there's another zone that can be accessed at the same time as the red zone, and it's this purple sandy zone. There isn't really any new feature in this zone other than the unique enemies it offers. And that is why this zone is my favorite, and I enjoyed most of the time I spent in it. Also, instead of just one major boss, there are 4 mini-bosses and then one final boss for finishing all the mini-bosses in a row. Now the mini-bosses are tough, but they aren't ridiculously tough, or unfair. The final boss of this zone was not that enjoyable to me, because it was mainly about dodging many different discs, which is above the amount that my brain could focus on at once, leading to many avoidable deaths. Still, I liked most of the levels of this zone, and for the most part I had a good time. Now the final zone is the white tiled zone. This one I kinda liked, but it was still quite frustrating. At this point, the hardest discs were being thrown around, and the new feature of this area is similar to the Gatekeepers. Instead of a timer, each white square you step on adds time to the clock. This made each level much harder, but it was still an interesting way to increase the difficulty, unlike just removing visibility or restricting the area you can be in. However, many of the levels reached the difficulty of almost being unfair, which made it feel a bit less like a final challenge zone and more like the game was just trying to kill you. The zone was definitely much better than the green and red zone, but still like half of these levels were not very fun, so it made for a mixed ending. The final boss was still quite a good boss, which made each death an experience to learn from and get frustrated at, rather than just get frustrated at. It's important to realize that this game is meant for repeated death, so getting frustrated at it should be expected. But in this type of game, I think the fault should be left to the player for not being able to complete the level, rather than the level for putting the player in impossible circumstances. The final boss does this very well, but much of the rest of the game does not. After finishing the final boss, the story concludes. This person in a purple suit is now bleeding for whatever reason from the explosion of some yellow orb. And there is also a bomb left inside the orb. Your character holds the blood, which turns into a clone of himself, and then flies away with the bomb, leaving the clone and the purple suit person behind. And credits. However, that is definitely not all the game has to offer. There are still more rooms left to explore in order to get 100% completion, such as the golden rooms and other secrets and objectives. In addition, completing the game unlocks a hard mode, where you can play against harder versions of the same levels. Each objective is now just to survive 10 seconds in each room. You also have the purple suit person following you around in each level. I don't really know what this adds to the gameplay, because they don't do anything, and if you die, then them being alive doesn't matter. This might be explained further into the hard mode because it appears that there is still a lot more Discrim has to offer. However, beating the game normally was good enough for me, because I did not want to do the same thing again and be even more frustrating this time. Hard mode is a good addition if the main game isn't enough for you. And while leaving it uncompleted may make this an incomplete review, the game at its core, even in hard mode, is just this. Attempt to avoid discs, die, repeat. And for what it's worth, I think hard mode is a good addition for people who like this game. Discrim is a simple, short game, which you may get more mileage out of depending on your tolerance for the frustration of repeated death. I did not think that the game was worth my playing, but this is certainly not the definitive opinion on the quality of the game. If the concept seems interesting or the things I had against the game don't seem too bad, then I am sure you will like it. After all, 95% of people thought that it was a good game. It is much more likely you will be in the 95% of people who liked it than the 5% who didn't. Even though this review doesn't represent everyone's opinions, I hope it was at least informative and interesting. Discrim is available for purchase on Xbox, Steam, Switch, Amazon Luna, and is available on Xbox Game Pass. Now thank you for watching till the end.